So they didn't hear any of what I just said. So, so once again, welcome. I think you weren't hearing anything before. So I'm just saying that we're going to be heading along now, and we're going to be doing one more little section in the Buddhist psychology of awakening. But then we're going to go ahead and look at what we call the 75 dharmas, and essentially what we refer to very often as the mental factors, which is what we associate with Abhidharma very often. It's simply just understanding what's happening in our mind in terms of experience. Because what we've looked at with Steven's discussion on the 18 dhatus is really looking at what takes place in terms of a subject and an object that perceives. So we're just breaking down what are the elements of our perception. And the project that we have is beginning to identify the role of the subject within the, you could say, the participation within our world, how we actually participate and experience. And the Buddhist objective of doing that is essentially based on, we could say, the phenomenal world has no problem. All phenomena are innately pure. The impurity comes from our individual subjective confusion in dealing with phenomena. So in that sense, you could say the reality is perfect. And that's a premise in the Buddhist teaching. Our mind, the phenomenal world, all of it exists within we could call it primordial perfection. What goes wrong is that we, on the basis of our conscious subjective engagement with that, and essentially what we call duality, we interact with the phenomena in a way that actually isn't in concordance with the nature of phenomena. Basically, we're just out of it. We lost it. We're in a tizzy. And so all the Buddha wanted to do was really just snap us out of it, snap us back into sanity. And so the method that the Buddha employs is what we call prajna, seeing. So it's not as if something landing heavy on our head is going to do the job, even though sometimes these methods have been employed. And occasionally, actually, we have some interesting phenomena with people who do get hit heavily on the head and who have all sorts of extraordinary capacities on the basis of that. But no, the Buddha's approach is, in order to understand reality, we have to see reality. And that's what's implicit in vipassana. And vipassana then is where we begin to identify what is it that constructs our experience. Now, again, the objective in the Buddhist context, in all of this analysis, is really to eliminate this subjective confusion that's taking place. So we need to identify how our subjective mind engages with reality. And this is not really a particularly Buddhist way of looking at it, even though, of course, probably within neuroscience and so on, you'd have other ways of looking at this. But we are essentially just operating with the very basics of our 5 senses and the mind. And nobody's going to deny that we have organs, we individually possess particular sense organs, that we have conscious experience, and there are objects that are the basis for this conscious experience. So in this way, breaking it down as we're doing here with the, these 3 realms, or these 3 spheres, these 3 channels, if you like, namely the organ, the field, and the conscious experience, and then applying that to the 6 senses, 5 ordinary senses in the mind, adds up to 18. There's nothing really particularly, you could say, culturally bound in any way. It's really just an analysis. So it's something that we can all do. There's not really any bones in this. But again, this process of looking at what's taking place within our experience, it makes us more aware. The more we're aware, the less this festering undercurrent of assumptions that lead to perpetuating the patterns of ignorance are dismantled. The more we analyze, the more we see. So we're with the analysis also in Buddhism, it's not as if we're actually that interested in arriving at, you could say, something, as more as we're more interested in seeing the complexity and the constructed nature of everything, and that is that which begins to dismantle our assumption that things possess some sort of inherent reality, because that's what we assume. Now, this chapter this section that we're going to look at now actually underscores this, what I'm just saying, which is where Steven says that makes a very interesting claim, namely, there is no such a thing as gray rectangle. And we've already been looking at one. And most of us probably will have seen a gray rectangle or two in our life. So this is interesting. This is where it could get a bit provocative, but I'm sure you suspect probably it's going to be some familiar analysis, namely what we call the middle way deconstruction. But that's important. So he says, the point I want to make here, and this goes for all the other channels, is there is no, no such a thing actually existent out there called gray or rectangle. So this is of course something that we operate within epistemology in general. Is there really an object? And are we really able to perceive the object? So the Buddhist approach is to begin with the actual label that we're using. And Steven says, gray is a word that consists of a series of vowels and consonants in a specific historically constituted language, in this case, English, right? So if you're Danish, you say grå. And if you're French, you would say grise, and so forth. Or gris. So you would say different things depending on where you're coming from. So that's you could say the way that we label things. Now, of course, this does make a difference, because the moment that we attribute a label on something, it already begins to attain some reality in our mind. So this is something that is, you could say, an essential part of the deconstruction of our experience. Okay, so referring to our 18 dhatus, Steven says, in fact, as a label, it is channel 6, right? Basically, and actually refers to a wide variety of different possible hues. Excuse me. See if that helps. Yeah. So-called gray scale. Okay, so it's already just not one particular color, but it is something that in fact exists in so many different ways. There's so many grays. The same applies for rectangle. They come in different lengths and sizes. In fact, we use these admittedly imprecise words in order to trick us into moving toward an already given visual field in order to have an experience of visual perception. So this happens to us when we're describing things or when we're classifying things, categorizing things. When we say, look at the gray rectangle, it is just a way of indicating how to move to a certain channel. So we're talking about something based on channel 6 experience, and we're referring to, there might not be a gray rectangle sort of within the horizons, right? But in our minds, we then think, oh yeah, gray rectangle. And then there might be something out there that looks like that. And that would then become the object of our, obviously, channel 1, the eye. So Steven says one form of channel 6, rather important one, is called memory or mindfulness, smriti. Memory is simply the name of an energy packet or a dhatu, a dharma, a specific functioning characteristic which allows us to stay with an object. Those with a good, robust, and trained memory are able to stay with an object for as long as they want. It is one of the primary energy packets, one of the primary dhatus or muscles that we train in shamatha. It's called mindfulness. Mindfulness and memory are the same thing. They refer to the capacity to stay with the focus. Shamatha is sometimes represented in Tibetan Buddhist tradition as a monk or a nun chasing his out-of-control mind, represented by an elephant. He chases it with two implements, a noose, representing mindfulness. So that's essentially a lasso. That's what you would catch the animal with. And then an elephant goad, or a ankusha, which represents alertness or samprajanya. So the goad of alertness or vigilance is the capacity to note when one has lost track of the mindfulness focus and is now alerted to bring the mind back to that focus. Okay? So when we're meditating on shamatha vipassana, when we're meditating on shamatha, we work with two things. One is this capacity that we know that we're present. We are actually there. And then there's the one that's just being on the spot, being present. And that's where when we're meditating, we can say, now I'm on the spot. And now we recognize, hey, I was distracted. That's the lack of mindfulness. But who is it that tells us that? That's then the alertness or awareness that knows what has been going on in the mind. So we're not just either on or off, but, well, we are in terms of mindfulness, but we have the awareness that knows what has been going on. So these two, they're very important because it's the awareness that tells us should go and practice mindfulness. Mindfulness, you could say, or the shamatha itself, is really just remaining in focus. And that's where we could say just having mindfulness is great. It's very helpful in terms of just being present. And within contemporary psychology, it is what bypasses then the whole drama around our traumas or memories and all these kind of things that we essentially continually, where we reactivate memory. But shamatha, or this mindful quality, it is essentially what is being completely present. And that's where what happened in the past, what might come next, is actually not necessarily something that has a reality beyond what we bring to it in terms of memory or regurgitating narratives and so forth. So this is radical. But the thing is, without the awareness that understands the context of this, and that's where we would appreciate the quality of being mindful and see the virtues of it, and also see it in terms of the path of liberation, the values of ethical action, the value of practicing mindfulness in terms of diminishing the toxic attitudes of the mind and so forth. That's where awareness has that whole, you could say, intelligent, educated perspective. And that's where awareness is what basically carries all the information that you might have gathered as a, let's say, a Buddhist or somebody that has an experience or a body of knowledge that motivates you then to basically act. But in this case, then we bring it to meditation. So it's essentially that thing that understands the value of meditation and then says to mindfulness, okay, you're on. And then the mindfulness is on, so, and then at one point, then the mind is drifting, and it's again the awareness that says, hey, you're distracted. But at that time, when we have that moment of realizing that we are distracted, at that point, mindfulness comes back basically without any contamination. It's very fresh. This is where the instructions that we have in the tradition of meditators, they very much celebrate this initial moment of just what we could call concept-free, non-conceptual, just mindfulness that we come back to. Anyway, these two are then what we're using in shamatha: mindfulness and awareness or vigilance. So Steven says, shamatha and memory. How can you remember afterwards that you were having these moments if it would have been only channel 1? So there you are, channel 1, you're seeing something, you have visual perception, but afterwards you know that took place, right? That's the memory. This goes down to what we then refer to as the all ground or the alaya vijnana, which we're not talking about here, but that is essentially within the realm of thought. So he says, there is no reason to remember at all. The instruction in shamatha is don't remember that you're looking at something gray. The instruction is simply to be with the object. Okay, that's particularly then in shamatha context. We just come back to the object. We don't have to reflect upon it. We're not encouraging. The normal thing that happens when we observe an object is that we begin to reflect and essentially get lost in reflections. So calming the mind is not going to help, or rather focusing on something where that's just generating associations and more thinking is not going to do anything to generate peace of mind. It's only when we come back to just the object itself without the, you could say, interpretation and the storyline that goes with it. So Steven says the instruction is simply to be with the object. And when you think, oh, what am I doing? Oh, I'm focusing on a gray rectangle. That's called a distraction. It is a memory, channel 6, of having been looking at a visual field. So, in fact, when we're meditating, if we begin to think about meditating while we're meditating, that's not meditating. That's just thinking. And that's actually just being distracted in channel 6. Now, it's a little bit subtle because just having a thought wouldn't necessarily constitute distraction if we're aware that we're having that thought. So you'll very often see that we, particularly then in the Vajrayana, we talk about not blocking the various sense doors. We would leave them open. But the trick really would be, and this does require some grounding in shamatha, to not be distracted. So we might have the thought as we're meditating, well, I'm meditating, but we could do that without being distracted. But of course, Steven's point here is that we could very well become absorbed in that thought, and essentially we could be completely distracted in the sense of being then involved with the thought, oh, what I'm doing, oh, I'm meditating. How's my meditation going? Will I ever learn to meditate? Gosh, I'm always so distracted. Wonder what's for dinner, you know, etc., etc. So there we go. That's where we get lost in thought. So shamatha and channel firing, slowing down. Now, when we slow down and experience things frame by frame, then to take another example, the moment you were focusing on the pain in your back, channel 5, if you really are with that channel, then the visual world disappears. And this is something we talked about earlier. We can only be really one moment of conscious experience after another. We don't actually multitask in that sense. Visual world, Steven says, means visual for you as a moment of experience. It is a technical term. There is no such a thing as a visual world apart from visual for me as experience. Or, if that is shocking and frightening, whatever way in which the visual field exists right now, apart from an experience for you, is totally disregarded by these traditions. Okay, back to the tree that falls in the empty forest, right? As far as what exists as a visual world, it is actually just constituted by our individual vision or individual perception of a particular object. So that's what we have. You know, wherever you are right now in front of a screen or whatever you might be doing, that is the actual visual experience. So as far as the approach here is concerned, we're not really analyzing it philosophically. So sort of the experience is just on the face value of just being engaged with the object, and what it is not really the point. So he says they're not interested in it, and it is not considered, and it is considered a distraction the moment that we're beginning to ponder what we're seeing. Remember, he says, this is a description of our experience when we slow down. The idea that there is a visual world out there while we are doing meditation is based entirely on habits of permanence, singularity, and independence. All right? Now, this is not how the world exists. The world is not permanent. It's not singular, and it's not independent. But we attribute these values on things. We do think that things are permanent. Not if we sit down and we're talking sense, but in terms of the way that we interact with our reality. We do think in terms of this is, this is the projector, this is so and so, etc. And we think in terms of singularity, that they exist as units, when in fact we cannot find a unit. This is probably where Buddhists and science could have some interesting discussion. Is there such a thing as a unit? Buddhists would say ultimately any unit isn't necessarily a construct. The smallest unit will always have a left, a right, an up, and a down. So the bottom line here is that we attribute permanent singularity, and also essentially saying that this is, this exists in this particular way unconditionally. This politician is a bad person. This politician is a good person. This person is good. This person is bad. This object is this, is that. It's all entirely imputing solidity that phenomena do not have. And so on the basis of that, you could say misapprehension of phenomena. Steven says, Buddhists call this a wrong view, because that view blocks full access to the path, which leads one to the goal, the destination, the cessation of suffering, and its myriad causes. And the view is to understand that phenomena don't possess that solidity. They are essentially what we could call dependent arisings, praticca samutpada. That is such a biggie. Now, he says, we're learning how to translate our ordinary experiences into specialized Abhidharma language. We are becoming bilingual. I would suggest that we take any experience and then ask a question about that experience in terms of Abhidharma language. How, for example, how would Abhidharmikas, meaning people who practice the Abhidharma, model the ordinary experience of hearing an alarm go off while one was doing shamatha meditation? Let's say the visual field of a letter R. This is very good, actually. Solzhenitsyn Rinpoche, he gives a great example of that, where he says, there you are meditating and your mobile phone goes off. And he gives a very specific instruction. If you're sitting meditating and your mobile phone goes off, he won't say switch it off, which most of us will do, even when we've heard this, and that's happened to me. Rinpoche gives one instruction, and that is, he says, this refers to meditating in a group. He says, don't switch it off, just watch the guilt. So there you are sitting with all your serene friends, and there you are, you're the flunky who's forgotten to switch off your mobile phone. And so this is very embarrassing, right? So you should just watch that. But essentially what that brings us around to is that we're not particularly looking at the phone, we're not looking at the space we're in, we're looking at the subjective experience and what that is that actually takes place. This is a very Abhidharmica approach, namely that you're shifting your attention from the white letter R, if that's the object or the breath or whatever, and then you're shifting the attention to then the thought. Now we could say this is distraction, and I think Steven will say that. But the thing is, the house is burning down, whatever it is, you're just distracted. Back to the breath, No, but we're essentially working towards gaining mental calm. And that's where, since we're always tagging along after our thoughts unconsciously, to begin to become conscious first of the letter R or a given object, or the thought, the house is burning down, the mobile phone is ringing. Of course, the point is not to not do something if the house is burning down. And of course, you could also switch off your mobile, but it's more that you're actually aware that there is thought taking place. It's not just where we're unconsciously driven, we jump up or whatever we do, but it's that we are aware of thought. So they're thinking, mobile phone, this is embarrassing, and then just staying with that embarrassment and becoming aware of this condition that ordinarily just drives us. This is where we begin to have a bit less what Steven calls fixity. We're a bit less, we're a bit more sophisticated, we're a bit more perspective, we have a bit more perspective. We know more about what's happening in the situation. He continues, let's say you're looking at something and seemingly at the same time you hear an alarm go off and then you think, oh, I have to start meditating. That habit of saying the alarm went off at the same time I was meditating is not accurate. The experience of actually occurring at the same time is a distortion. So what's happening is we're meditating, we're focused on the letter R, breath, or whatever. Then we hear something. Actually, these are not taking place at the same time. One is the focus moment. The other is when we're then listening to something else. Of course, the implication is when we practice mindfulness, thanks to awareness, we know, this is happening. I'm going to go back to my mindfulness practice. And that's where awareness tells us, hey, get back to being not distracted. Again, here it applies that we could also be not distracted while we are having particular thoughts or we're hearing something. We don't necessarily, in a Vajrayana context particularly, we wouldn't necessarily say that is a moment of distraction. But here, just essentially to identify this way that these dhatus work, then we can see there's a shift from one channel to the other. So first is the eye that's looking at the letter R, then there's the channel 2, the ear, that fires. So he says, if you slow down enough, you learn that what you thought was a simultaneous experience of looking at an object and hearing the alarm, actually that what appears, what you thought was a simultaneous experience of looking at an object and hearing the alarm, actually consists of different moments. A moment of looking, another moment of looking, then a moment of hearing, then back to a moment of looking, then perhaps several moments of thinking, and then a moment of thinking, oh, that's the alarm. I guess my meditation session is over. There is oscillation, a switching between channels. So this we've already established, right? It is said that if we slow down enough, if we have the calm of mind, and rest in that state, shamatha, we can become aware that switching from channel 1, which is then essentially visual perception, seeing, to channel 2, hearing, and then to channel 6, having the thought that the meditation session is over. So for most people, this snippet of our experience goes by very fast, and it has a sense of continuity, of verisimilitude. So we think it's something that actually really is a continuous experience. So we have this. We're watching a movie, we're seeing something, at the same time we're hearing, and we have this sensation that it's all very real. Steven says we don't really become aware of the rapid channel switching. We have a tendency to get involved in the content of our personal movies, the dramas of our life. We might think it's too much effort to slow my mind down. I don't feel like practicing. If we don't learn to slow down, our thoughts and emotions are out of control, and we're more at a risk of experiencing the arising of stress with all its physical and emotional consequences. So that's a nice way of saying it, but the thing is, this is actually what sparks off everything that we call samsara, because essentially, without that inquiry into the components of what it is that constitutes our experience, we are operating with this sense of a solid world in which there is a continuity, and we fail actually to see that it's us that are attributing this perception of what we looked at earlier, namely permanence, independence, and sort of a unitary quality. And this is really just the mind that's attributing that. The phenomena themselves don't have that. So our way of imposing this way of solidifying duality is essentially constituted by this assumption that there is a continuous reality that's taking place, and we're witness to it, when in fact it is just a discontinuous, or you could say a constructed reality that we're looking at, and it's really just us with our particular way of constituting this continuity that attributes then a solidity to phenomena that they don't possess. So this is where the Abhidharma then contributes to what we would call this vipassana, this wider perspective. That is where this also helps us with understanding what we're generally working with when we talk about the whole notion of dependent arising, that phenomena don't have any reality to them the way that we think of them. There's different ways that we think of this thing that we call the two truths in the different Buddhist traditions. So of course we have, the Buddha made a point. Buddha said, I never disagree with the people of the world. And of course, it's not as if the Dalai Lama, if you hand him a chapati, and he would then say, this is not chapati, this is, clear light or emptiness or whatever. The Dalai Lama said, or somebody says, what's this? And the Dalai Lama said, well, this is a chapati. So we understand that the phenomena of the world, they exist as we agree on them. But again, we within the world, we also understand that the phenomena of the world don't actually possess a reality in and of themselves. For example, we might be with our parents, and we would then refer to our mother as mom, and so would our siblings. But then again, our dad might say, my partner. Now we agree that it's the same person we're talking about, but we have two different labels depending on where we're coming from. So similarly also with reality, the whole of reality that we're experiencing is a reality that we're constituting, which for us is real, but we're very much operating within a shared experience where we might say that's a car, but at the same time there might be a mouse that's living inside, inside the trunk or something, and that thinks this is home. So we as humans, we share a common label saying this is a car, but from another perspective, it doesn't appear in that way. Now this just goes to prove that phenomena don't have the reality that we attribute to them in terms of labels. Now this is kind of understandable, but it does constitute what we then would refer to as two truths, which is that we understand that we have a particular way of seeing things, and that's valid, but the object itself doesn't have any truth in and of itself. And that's what constitutes absolute truth. And that is actually what provides wisdom, because the moment that we hear a piece of music that we really love, and then somebody else comes along and says, nah, I don't like that, then it's actually thanks to absolute truth that we tolerate that. Because we'd say, oh yeah, well, the music in itself doesn't possess its own value. It's not like there is a good and a bad. It's just that how we perceive it. So we actually understand absolute truth the moment that we're tolerating that other people see the same thing differently. And we would actually, in the world, ordinarily, we would identify somebody as wise who understands the viewpoint of others. This is why politics is so impossible, because that's where we all sort of gang around what we would say, this is the truth. And then there's the other mob that says, no, this is the truth. The sage wouldn't actually be very good at politics, because the sage would pretty much agree with anybody, at the same time not agree with anybody at all. The sage would understand that these truths that we hold, they're entirely true from who we are, but also the reality that we're talking about doesn't actually exist. And this is where the notion of wisdom comes in, and what we're essentially doing in the Buddhist path, and what constitutes what we could say the non-violence of the whole Buddhist nature, is that we're beginning to understand how our truths are not necessarily true ultimately. And the more we understand this absence of reality in phenomena themselves, the more actually we begin to open up to the nature of reality, rather than just diminishing reality into how we like to pigeonhole them. And that is where the sage never gets into a fight, And that's why the sage, yes, agrees with everybody, but also understand that all these beliefs around things, this is a lovely piece of music, this is a terrible piece of music, you know, actually doesn't apply. So you, for example, you go to Bali and you listen to a concert of gamelan, and you'd have two Balinese that would say, well, that was well performed, and another one who says, no, they're not very good. And me who doesn't get gamelan at all, or not very well, I'm gonna be just saying, well, I'm gonna step away from this discussion because I basically don't have an opinion about these two things. And that's actually where, in some way, the moment that we have less judgment, less rigidity around things, this is actually comes from a place of understanding this, you can say, essentially absolute truth. This is also where we talk about the emptiness of things. Now, in the different Buddhist vehicles, we talk about the way that we break things down, because ultimately it's not just about how we subjectively construct things, but it's also about looking at the actual objective reality of things. So that's where, for example, if we take a table, we would say, here is a table, but that's really just something that we label. And then we can say, can we find the essence of table in that table? Well, we can. We actually will come down to particles. And at the end, the different Buddhist schools, they differ slightly in those that would say, well, there are some particles that we can't break down any further. That's the building blocks of reality. And this corresponds pretty much to what we have in materialist science, that we would say there are some building blocks of phenomena, atoms or quarks or whatever they might be. And we say they can't get any smaller than that. And that's where some of the traditions in Buddhism and some of the philosophical schools will say, well, absolute truth is to understand that phenomena, they appear to us in a particular way, but absolute truth, in absolute truth, they're just constructed by little particles. So this is where there are Buddhist schools that would say absolute truth is just understanding how everything is made up of particles. And they probably agree with materialist physicists on this one. Similarly, also, when we identify that we have moments of consciousness, like we've just within this data analysis, we've seen that we have a moment of looking, and then at the same time we hear the whirring of the projector, and we think, oh, that's taking place in the same time. We're actually beginning to see, well, it's super small moments of seeing and hearing that are discrete. They're not mixed together. And that's where the notion of continuity leads us to believe that there is sort of a mingling of these perceptions. Whereas if we identify that every perception actually takes place in these little moments, that's where we begin to understand that there's not really continuity. There's just moments of consciousness continually, but we link them together and we label them as a continuity. And this is where we begin to, if we analyze that, just like if we analyze a table, we come down to seeing that we just have these little short moments of consciousness. So there's some schools that would say, well, that consciousness, that's real. So you do have a real subjective consciousness, and you do have a real phenomenal world out there. In the Mahayana, they would say anytime that anything is constituted, it doesn't possess an inherent existence. Anytime that something, we have the smallest particle, we would say it's still constituted, it still stands in relationship, it still has a left and a right, it still is what Elizabeth Matters Namgyal says, it still leans, it's still independence, there's still interconnectedness, if you like. And as such, there's not a single phenomena that exists as an absolute. Everything stands in relation. If it didn't stand in relation, if phenomena didn't stand in relation, then it would all just be one big lump. Let's not go into the Big Bang Theory and that sort of like that kind of lump. It just means it's an logical impossibility. So that's where we would say phenomena ultimately don't from their own side possess any inherent existence. There's nothing that actually exists absolutely. And that's where when we say phenomena exists on the basis of dependent arising, that they're conditional, that's basically synonymous with saying that they don't possess anything that we can grasp. They're empty. That's the term shunyata. So that's with regards to the objective world. So if you were to say, well, somebody was asking me this today, do Buddhists believe there's something objectively out there? And I would have to say, as far as the dimension of what we call objectives goes, Buddhists would say this is where we're deceived. We're deceived into thinking that there is something objectively out there. And they would say the objective realm of phenomena, the nature of this appearing realm of phenomena, is actually emptiness. It cannot be grasped. And that's really the dividing line between, you could say, the awake Buddha and the deceived sentient beings, where the awakened one knows that there is nothing that can be grasped, whereas we, ordinary sentient beings, we actually cling on to things. That's why we're struggling with reality. We're struggling with reality because we're attributing permanence to what doesn't have permanence. We're attributing singularity to what doesn't have singularity. We're attributing independence to what in fact is constituted and conditional. So as far as the objective world goes, then in Buddhism we go through a fair amount of pain, actually, or we take pains, I should say. we emphasize a lot the value of analyzing and seeing that phenomena, there has nothing about them that can be grasped. That is really just not from the point of view of getting the math right, but it's just from the point of view of understanding the nature of reality. And it has that wonderful thing that we cease to do, just like when we begin to judge things or we get rigid around things. It's where the sage begins to open up to a dimension of reality that is not about fixating on things in a way that they actually don't exist. So freeing the mind from this ordinary stress of being held up by this fixation is not just from the point of view of philosophical project of finding out what things are, but it's freeing the mind. It's the mind that no longer labels and objectifies. And when the mind labels and objectifies, what happens is that then we have like and dislike. And once we have this like and dislike, that has nothing to do with the object. That's how we're projecting onto the object. But that constitutes this duality of me. So I begin to have a stronger, the more I become more of a fusspot, then the more I actually consolidate my fusspot identity. And I label something as good and bad, which has nothing to do with the object itself. So all I'm doing is really just, spiraling down into a rather narrow space of my fusspotness, and essentially being sort of a spoiled person who's not really interested in reality, but I'm only interested in the reality as per me. And that's where we do this whole filtering, where we're not relating to phenomena, we're just relating to things as we would want them. So that's where we begin to fail to relate to reality, and we're just constructing on the basis of us identifying and fixating and pigeonholing reality in a particular way. We then begin to have likes and dislikes and perpetuate these narratives of good and bad. And essentially we then turn in this circle of not really relating to the nature of phenomena, but just turning in a circle of our sort of anguished struggle with reality. And the sage would like to say that's unnecessary. So that's why the sage says, have a look at things. They don't actually possess this reality that you attribute to it. Then you might say, well, that wisdom then that sees that must be something real. And that's where we would say that too, there's nothing about it that can be grasped. So it's not as if the Dalai Lama sits up there and he's like so on top of the world and he's so on top of it. He's like so superior because he's so wise and so funny and so good and all of that, and compassionate. And he's like, I'm rather compassionate, or I'm incredibly wise. That's the beauty of this sage, is that similarly, the sage would understand that the mind itself has nothing about it that can be grasped. The moment that we actually begin to do that, we're perpetuating the same duality again. That mind that I like, or that mind that I'm fixating on, and that again perpetuates this solidity of self again, where we're just perpetuating endlessly the drama of getting what I want, not getting what I want, and so forth. So this is where the whole exercise that we're doing here which is breaking down the way that we see reality, comes with a very real objective, which is actually gaining a wider perspective. So it's not just about having a particular, you can say, Indo-Tibetan view on how we see things, but it's more just actually something that helps us in terms of our predicament. So the Buddha really taught these ways of analyzing our perception really from the point of view of extracting us from our ordinary assumptions. So the Buddha is not denying the ordinary everyday world where we have cars and we have taxes and we have, croissants and we have coffees and we have people, and they're all called different things and we see them differently and so on. But there the Buddha is fine, and that's where we would say the Buddha actually agrees with what we call relative truth. No problem. The Buddha would agree with physics. The Buddha wouldn't argue with physicists about anything. But what the Buddha would say that ultimately none of this has any reality. So I'm not saying that they don't appear, they appear, but they're not something that we can ultimately grasp. So in that way, the Buddha would make a clear point about accepting the world, but also at the same time being very clear on what we call absolute truth in terms of not being fooled by the appearances. Okay, now we're going to skip to, because the rest of the chapter, I think it's pretty much talking about something we've already talked about. So I think we can continue here. See if I can get this to work. Yeah. Okay. So with the data analysis, we've essentially looked at the structures of the mind. Now we're going to look at what we experience. And this is more on the level of then what we call mental factors or mental experiences in terms of emotions, in terms of mental states. For example, positive, constructive mental states or destructive, negative states, and so forth. Okay, so actually, before we begin, I'm just going to see if there's some questions here. All right. Is sound okay? Okay, got sound. Is memory not more about what has already happened, while mindfulness is more about recognizing the present moment of departing from nowness? Yes. So you could say memory, okay, coming back to this discussion about the differentiating between mindfulness and awareness. So memory is more situated within awareness that just knows what happened and in general just understanding the context. Whereas mindfulness is really just that quality of not being distracted and actually being with the present moment. So right, yes. So you're right. Mindfulness is more about recognizing the present moment of departing from mindfulness, from nowness. Well, mindfulness is when you don't depart from the nowness. But yeah. Did I answer your question? Okay. Then it says, then there is also labeling that is due to our perception of function. So the process of identification is not merely one of nominalization alone. Yeah, that's right. So I think this probably will add what we're going to be looking at now, because our perception of function is very much based on where we're coming from. So in sense of our particular agenda, the way that we evaluate things and so on. But coming back to the data analysis, our perception of functions is situated within, again, channel 6. So whether it's mind or the stuff or the conscious mental experience, all of that is pretty much where we identify these things like function and so forth. Yeah. Okay. So we're talking about moments of seeing or hearing, but isn't seeing itself more likely many different parts of each eye collecting different photons of light, and then we label that a moment of seeing? Sure, but I might ask, what do you think?
Sure.
Well, the Department of Science nods.
I mean, the thing is that one of the distinctions you have to make is that there's physical processes operating in different parts of the brain simultaneously. And it's the awareness that breaks it into, now I'm intending to this, I'm intending this. That's where the gaps seem to come in.
Okay, so physical, yeah, the various physical elements, they are operating simultaneously. Yeah, that's happening.
Yeah.
But it's the awareness that is taking place within singular moments, right? Yeah. But basically, I think as what you're saying here, what you're doing here, if I'm not wrong, is essentially identifying the complexity of experience. And you're right. And I don't think the Buddha or anybody would disagree that probably what science has found in terms of, you know, the eye collecting different photons of light, and that we then label a moment of seeing, that's absolutely valid. And again, it's simply just, again, operating with how, in fact, well, I guess here you're talking about how particularly the capacity, right? So we're talking about this capacity, how it interacts with the field or with the object, right? So prior to the visual perception as such, right? So you're really just, you could say, identifying the complexity of that process, I imagine. This periodic table might be considered by some Madhyamikas as an exercise in pigeonholing itself. Oh yeah, that's true. Well, you see, there's two kinds of Madhyamikas. There's those who very much appreciate how we understand relative truth and what are you could say, what constitutes relative truth. So that's where everything that has to do with, you could say, the epistemological project of how do we validate experience. That's very much the scope of the Yogacharyans and also the Sautrantikas, and different schools put a lot of emphasis on this. And then along comes the Madhyamikas and Nagarjuna saying, well, I don't have any opinion, and that's why I'm free. And that's all very good. And that's why Tsongsakensi would say the Madhyamikas, they're a bit the hippies in this whole thing. But it's valid enough because, yes, of course, as long as we are labeling anything, that is pigeonholing, right? But as far as operating within, you could say, a valid science and a flawed science, and understanding our reality in a valid way, and understanding how does confusion originate, and what can we do about it? What is it like when there's absence of confusion? That's where the Yogacharyans and the people who, you could say, operate with this pigeonholing process, they're quite helpful. And that gives us some certainty about what is this process. It's not just that we're going to sit there and hold hands and chant Om and everything's beautiful and thoughts go away and we don't have any pigeonholing taking place. That's you know, that's not going to help much except just be a very sort of just short-lived little blissful experience. So that's where the Abhidharma and in general the Abhidharma and Pramana and so forth, these disciplines are quite valuable. Okay, so just a follow-up question. And even a moment of awareness might be the synthesis of many of those sense microcomponents or moments. Yes, but that's also where the Abhidharmikas, they also say that we're not just talking moments in terms of a second or two, we're talking about micro moments. So yeah, the image of the 64 dried leaves that are penetrated by somebody driving a spike or a nail through 64 dry leaves, right? The time it takes for the nail to penetrate one of those leaves, that's what we call the smallest component of time, according to the Abhidharma, right? So they are also onto some way of mapping these so-called sense microcomponents or moments. So you're a natural You're a natural Abhidharmika. Okay. By function, I was thinking a chair serves as something to sit on, and so we do not collectively label it as a chair merely to give it a nominal value. No, it's absolutely makes complete sense, and we need it. But then again, if I'm a little rat and I'm living inside the chair comfortably, I have a very different perception of it. So just to identify the relativity of these objects, right? I look at something and I think, how does this serve, or what use does it have? Yeah. But that's all absolutely valid. But you see, that's relative truth. And that's where we all have different views on, some will say, wow, that's an amazing chair. And some will say, that's a terrible chair, bad design, and so on. Actually, that's interesting. This is a little bit an aside. I'll leave it. But anyway, there were some friends of mine who were involved with an art movement called Fluxus. And there was a couple of French members of this movement, Robert Filliou and Edwige Regenwetter, who was French too. But they had this thing that was called the chair of ideas. And they basically deconstructed the chair. How is the chair seen? This chair, is this the chair? And they looked at the back, the back of the chair, the seat of the chair, and they completely took apart this whole idea of chair and they had sort of little chapters on this little pictures of the chair and parts of the chair, and seeing how we could see these various parts and what they could function as and so forth. It was a great. I love that book. It was just a little thing that had made, and of course, it was just conceptual art, so it didn't fall into the category of Madhyamika particularly. But it's actually interesting because Robert Filliou, he together with his wife went on and actually became students of Buddhism and actually did retreat and so on. I knew them fairly well, but just to say that this idea of deconstruction exists universally, really. And yes, also in the... Okay, any questions from the live studio audience here? Okay. Okay, so we've basically, with these 18, we're looking a little bit about how our perceptions take place. And now we're going to look more about, you could say, the emotional component, or how we mentally react or interact in terms of what occurs in our mind, the moods in our mind that are constructed on the basis of these various experiences. So we'll start there next time. Okay. I'll dedicate. By this merit, may all attain omniscience, may it defeat the enemy wrongdoing, from the stormy waves of birth, old age, sickness, and death, from the ocean of samsara, may all beings be free. May bodhicitta, precious and sublime, arise where it has not yet come to be, and where it has arisen, may it never fail, but grow and flourish evermore and more. Okay. 2-minute break, and then we'll talk a bit about meditation and then do some meditation. Okay. So, all right. Again, the beautiful thing about the Buddha was that, as far as truth goes, he never ever presented truth beyond just actually asking people to just look at their reality. So the whole notion of the Buddha's teaching, which is not as somebody who's presenting truth or a prophet, or obviously not as God, but really just as somebody who awoke and just could see, hey, all we need to do here is look at reality. And that's implicit in the notion of vipassana. That's implicit in the whole thing that really Buddhism hinges on, is on wisdom. And the intelligence or the capacity or the presence or the sharpness that sees through deception. But here we're not talking about deception as in the men in black and the government and everybody out there that's the evil universe. We're talking about self-deception. And so we would say reality in itself is perfect. The subjective dimension itself is perfect. But what goes wrong is that we misconstrue the nature of our consciousness, and through that we also misconstrue and misunderstand the perception of reality. All the Buddha wanted us to do was just to begin to be less confused. And so that's where the Buddha encouraged us to look, and we've just been looking at the Abhidharma, which is an analysis of what constitutes our experience. And once we begin to become more aware of that, we actually begin to be less prone to jump onto our judgments. I mean, we all know, for example, let's say we meet a terrible person, and then we find out the history of this terrible person. The person was abused as a kid. The person hasn't eaten for a whole day, hasn't slept because something happened, that, et cetera, et cetera. And the more we understand the complexity of what we initially label as just a one-shot deal, we actually begin to dismantle our assumptions about the reality. And so, like what we're doing with anything that we analyze, we would actually say there's nothing that withstands analysis. This is a very interesting Madhyamika expression. Nothing withstands analysis, meaning that as soon as we begin to analyze things, we actually will never find anything. The more we ask questions, the more complex things. Try this at home. This you can try at home. You could analyze anything, any person, any given, you could say, idea, and you could analyze it, and you can see if you can find anything that actually withstands analysis, can see that it's not constituted by different things, it's not conditioned by different things. So that's where the intelligence that begins to dismantle our assumptions that we impose on reality is actually what's going to free us. It's not that we're going to be beamed up, or we're going to drop a tab of something, or there's just some great power that's going to lift us out of here or whatever. It's actually through our discerning, our looking. And of course, the example that we're always given for this is if we at night and we stumble across, if we're on a path and all of a sudden we see a snake and we're terrified, and then we look a bit harder and then we see there's actually not a snake there, it's just a striped rope. What frees us is not that the snake went away, it's not that we were saved by the grace of God, but it's that we actually looked, and it's through looking, that we understand that there actually was no snake. And the same for our consciousness and our experience of samsara. The Buddha doesn't think that actually that the realities that we're undergoing and all the suffering that we're undergoing has any reality, except for us it's real. And the Buddha is just like somebody who would say to me, hey, Jakob, it's not a snake, it's just a rope. It's somebody who would say, hey, try and have a look. It's not what you think it is. And the whole project that we have in Buddhism, just boring, as dreadful, as unrelenting, that you could say Buddhism is in terms of its emphasis on understanding the hard science of things. It's premised on, if we understand what things are, we won't be held by them. And that's why the Buddhists will emphasize an actual, what we could call it, scientific analysis. Except Buddhism goes beyond what ordinary science does in terms of just, as you could say, objectivist science, in terms of just how things are and how they function, is actually understanding what is it that drives confusion and what is it that will set us free from confusion. But that is partly also then looking at what is the nature of this so-called objective reality. So that's where the role of analysis that we've just been talking about, where it comes in. But it's not going to help us if we just emerge as philosophers who've sort of figured it all out and we have some sort of nerdy conclusion about how things are and we can lecture endlessly about something. Then we would just become unbearable. Then nobody would want to be in the same room as Buddhists, these sort of know-it-alls that just, you know, sit until early morning drinking coffee and basically propounding the truth. That would be unbearable. And luckily, the Buddha taught a modality that goes beyond philosophy, beyond intellectualism, and which is really what enables us to begin to really see clearly, which is calming the mind and allowing the mind to regain its natural intelligence. The thing is, the mind spirals into confusion so easily. And that's where the vipassana, or the insight, doesn't come from having an already preconceived idea about what reality is. It's by actually not falling for the ordinary delusion that the mind constructs. So in fact, you could say the premise of meditation is that the mind possesses this purity. And what we're doing within meditation is actually sustaining this purity through just being present and not allowing the ordinary conceptual mind to get the ordinary control and grip that it imposes on us. So to do that, we operate with giving ourselves the best possible situation, which is sitting. There's not as if we're going to become enlightened just by sitting in a particular posture, but it does provide for a framework in which we actually could be the best we are in terms of just being sharp on the spot. One Tibetan Lama who came to the West in the early days, he noticed when he went to the movies, he noticed that when things got really sort of incredibly compelling and gripping in the movie, everybody sits up in perfect meditation posture. Everybody sits up straight and is really present. So it's innate to us to have this quality of being awake when we actually sit with a straight spine and when there's a bit of a posture happening. The prescriptions for how to sit and meditate, or essentially sitting like the Buddha, is actually founded on the identifying the yoga of this posture that enables us to align ourselves with a great degree of clarity. So we talk about how we would say when the nadis are straight, then the prana is straight. When the prana is straight, the bindu, or the essence of who we are, is straight. And then we would say, if the bindu is straight, the mind is straight. But we would also say bindu and consciousness, more or less the same thing. Anyway, we basically would say if the nadis, meaning the posture is straight, then the energy flows better, and also then the mind is clearer. So that's why the emphasis on meditation. But of course, when the Dalai Lama himself, he sort of bemoans that if people think Buddhism, they right away think of people in meditation posture, and that's like, he says, that's missing the point of what we're trying to do. It's not like it's an ultimate in itself, but it's just very helpful, and it is really providing the ideal conditions for us. So in terms of being present and aware of what's going on in the mind, the posture is quite helpful. Then when we're sitting, then of course the purpose is to sustain this quality of mindfulness, to be present. And the reason why mindfulness is so valuable is because ordinarily we unconsciously are, as we were just seeing with the data analysis, we're gripped by objects. And on the basis of us engaging with an object, with our sense faculties, we then generate particular mental stories, mental attachments, mental identifications, and so forth. This we're going to look at more in the coming studies of the Abhidharma, but essentially the mind is continually distracted. And so we're basically not here. And there's something, this is interesting actually. We actually operate on autopilot. I mean, we drive from one part of town to the other, and how present are we actually as we're doing it? It's scary actually to think how many sort of little daydreams and narratives and regurgitations and ruminations are taking place as we operate heavy machinery and do all sorts of potentially very dangerous things. So we should actually have some humble awareness that we are generally distracted. Now, where we find out we're distracted, particularly, is if you sit down and meditate. And that's where many people, they'd be tempted to throw in the towel, because you sit down, you meditate, and you think, oh, well, I'm going to sit down and meditate, and I'm going to be free from thought. And I bet you that's bliss. And I look at all these other people, and they're looking incredibly beautiful and blissful, and I want to be one of them. And then you sit down and meditate. And it's not as if your mind is going to be replaced by anything new. It's the same old, same old. And, what's for dinner? Did I remember to buy loo paper? And did I pay my taxes? And, did so-and-so take the garbage out? And all of that. And so we're back to the same old narratives, My brother, he did this to me, and my dad and my neighbor and, the dogs or whatever it might be. These stories. And so it's when we sit down and meditate that we become aware how much we actually are continually, more or less consciously distracted by this undertow, this undercurrent of thought. And that's where mindfulness is actually really radical, because that's actually where we have a way of not stopping the thoughts. Forget about stopping the thoughts. That's not going to happen. But what we could do is not be distracted by the thoughts. And that's where we have a very simple, very effective methodology, which we call mindfulness of then an object. And that's where we generally would think of mindfulness of, for example, the breath. Like Steven was mentioning, focusing on the syllable ah or something. But just focusing on the breath, having that as the object, is something that we come back to. So as we're sitting and we're having all the usual thoughts, and possibly actually, as within neuroscience and so on, they would identify that we regurgitate and repeat thoughts continually. This happens so much. And there was one place where they identified something like, there's a sort of it's obviously a rough estimate, but something like 60,000 thoughts in one day. We have actually, according to what we were talking about with the Abhidharma, right? Every time that our mind goes out to a particular object, and we're thinking that at the same time we're hearing something, we both have the visual field and the hearing happening. That actually constitutes moments of consciousness. So as many as there are micro moments of consciousness, we actually would have micro moments of thoughts, right? So 60,000, that would be a very optimistic estimate. It could be a lot more. Anyway, that's beside the point to some extent. What we would want to introduce here is seeing that, knowing that we are continually carried away by thoughts, that there's a way that we could actually sustain presence. And this is not by stopping the thoughts, but it's by us not tagging along with the thoughts. And that's where meditation is radical in proposing mindfulness, because that is where we ordinarily just tag along with thoughts. We just come back to an object. And this doesn't mean that we close off necessarily to the world, but it actually means we connect with the world, because we actually, what we do when we're caught up in our thoughts is actually we're walking around with blinders. And we have that so much. We're sort of not really seeing. We go down the street, right? We're driving or we're walking down the street, and we're continually sort of regurgitating all sorts of stories that are happening. We might not be aware of it. Where when we're practicing mindfulness, this is actually where we literally become mindful, in the sense that we become properly present. We might have an object of mindfulness like the breath, but that doesn't necessarily constitute some sort of trance that we're going into. It rather becomes an anchor that keeps us in the present moment. So the object of mindfulness is something that brings us to connect with reality. We're actually properly here. For example, if we're having a coffee in a busy place, we can't prevent people around us from moving around. But what we can do is focus on our friend that we're having that we're chatting with. And the comedy, of course, is that if we don't do that, our friend is going to be hugely insulted. You know, he or she is sitting telling us something, and we are like, uh-huh, 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 you know, and we're we're not there. And they would very quickly get very annoyed with us. So, not just from that point of view, but also just because we possibly would like to be there, we are actually able to focus with somebody. We might hear things, but we don't give it full attention. And so we are giving the person that we're talking with our full attention as we're engaging with them, and we're aware of other things going on. But it's really just in passing instances, and essentially our focus is directed to such an extent that the other perceptions we're having don't constitute something that sparks off, you could say, a complete absorption. So for example, if there's a sound going on, you know, maybe the barista is sort of, you know, doing something with the milk or whatever, that doesn't mean that we sort of go completely off into that and are absorbed by that. We just hear it's happening and we're back on track. And that's where it doesn't generate a particular mental state. Now, what the objective is with this exercise is not just that we could become incredibly focused, but it really means that we're not disturbed by the thoughts that arise, because what generally happens in our life is that we are very much disturbed by what arises in our mind. This could be, I like this and I don't like that. I'm angry at so and so. I want that. And we operate with a place where we become very tight. And this is very much in reaction to these thoughts that arise in the mind. The moment that actually we would have thoughts arise and we allow them a bit to arise without necessarily being carried away by them, it's a bit like if you take a real powerful young horse that's just bursting to just move. And if you try to confine this horse in a very small space, obviously it's going to go nuts and, you know, it'll kick and everything. If you put it into a large meadow, it's going to be happily sort of prancing around and horsing around and having a fantastic time. And actually, it won't be a problem. You won't have an issue. I remember Trungpa Rinpoche, he gave the example of a cat. If you leave a cat in a room, you close the doors and windows, you're going to come home and all the furniture has been completely destroyed, right? Whereas if you leave the doors and the windows open, the cat's just going to go to sleep in the sofa. So the moment that we try to confine the mind, it's not going to help. But what we're doing with mindfulness is essentially just being present, but not controlled by the way that the mind normally grips us, and where we unconsciously are just absorbed and tagging along with thoughts. So it's not about controlling the mind, but it's really just about being present and seeing the mind within the wider context of just being where we are. So in no way, when is meditation something about retreating into a sort of cosmic fetus position where we are sort of like comfortable and recharging, and meanwhile we still sustain this attitude, the world out there is evil, and I'm just going to go into my meditation where I can recharge because the world out there is evil and I want to be sane. And the world out there is not evil, but we think of it as evil because we're continually struggling with the world. We're continually having these rigid fixations about the world, and that's consolidated by this sense of me in relation to this evil world. And this, we're not the only one. This toxicity is pervasive everywhere. So we do have a lot of madness taking place in the world. We're not denying that. But each and every one of us, we are constituting this insanity by the fact of just tagging along with our own subjective thoughts and actually not really being properly present. So the degree to which we begin to be present without being just absorbed in our thoughts is actually by coming back to just connecting properly with where we are. And this we do through the object of mindfulness, the breath. So in fact, when we are operating in a distracted state, we're like having blinders. But when we're meditating, interestingly, despite what it might look like, it's actually the time when we are fully, properly present by the sheer fact that we're not tagging along with the ordinary conceptions. Now, the way that we do that with mindfulness, particularly then the method here, is that as we're sitting, we come back to the breath. And this here is where we would come back to the out breath. As we're sitting, we're aware of the breath that exits from our nostrils. And as we're attentive to this breath that exits from our nostrils, then we focus on that, and this becomes our reference point. And this is where we then sustain presence through awareness of this breath that exits from our nostrils. At the same time, we're going to have thoughts that come up. And that's where whatever thoughts that arise at that time, we simply just label it thinking. We don't evaluate whatever thoughts are coming up. What normally happens with us is we're sitting and then a thought comes up, I need to do this, or this happened, or this imaginary conversation, so on. And all of a sudden, we're just lost. We're not here anymore. We're essentially tagging along and absorbed by these thoughts. So the method with coming back to the breath is essentially something that anchors us in being properly present. So the object of mindfulness is the out breath. Particularly here, we emphasize more the out breath because it's what connects us takes us a little bit out of our heads, takes us out of this ordinary confined notion of me. But of course, the in breath should happen. Be unfortunate if it doesn't. But that's where we just allow a gap as the in breath happens, and again we are attentive to the out breath. So as we're meditating, then we're essentially aware of the out breath, then a gap, and again aware of the out breath. And as we're meditating, we might think, well, something's supposed to happen. I'm waiting for some sort of particular state of mind to take place. That's not going to happen. The embarrassing, ordinary, pedestrian, domestic quality of meditation is that we're just connecting with reality. The ordinary mind that sort of is hankering for some sort of something more is actually operates with a very poverty-stricken mentality that something should be feeding us. We should be given something deep and meaningful and big, and So the quality of meditation is very much that we begin to relate to the ordinary experience of being present. Of course, what this does result in is an extraordinary sensitivity and an extraordinary awareness beyond the ordinary, you could say, blinders that we wear. So it does have a quality of going beyond the ordinary, but it doesn't come from the fact of something extraordinarily having happened, an object that we can hang ourselves onto, but rather it just comes from this confidence that lies in us being present and not really being dependent on some particular mental content. Simply just coming back to being present and non-distracted is good enough. What happens? So we have the posture, sitting. Second aspect is mindfulness of the breath that enables us to connect with being present. And the last aspect, and this is where it goes into vipassana, is where thoughts arise, where we ordinarily are controlled by and tag along and absorbed by thoughts. This is where we actually just are aware of thoughts that arise and let them be. We're not trying to control them. They can be very ordinary thoughts. They can be incredibly insightful thoughts, but we let them be. We're not intended to control them or in any way manipulate them. We let them be, just like we would let a horse free in a big paddock, or we would let the cat just do whatever it likes. And we're not in any way trying to evaluate what happens in our mind. We're not going into the storylines about what we're thinking. We're extracting ourselves from our ordinary fascination with our thinking. And that's where we begin to connect beyond just the ordinary, you could say, self-absorption that is around the drama of me. We begin to have this wider perspective. And that's also where we would say the natural quality that comes from meditation is compassion. Because when we become less absorbed in ourselves and more actually participatory and part of the world around us, and we become more aware of the other. And so there's a natural falling away of this rigid sense of I and other. And these barriers melt to some extent in the sense that we're no longer operating with the same alienated relationship with the world. It's not like me against the other, us against them, and so forth. There's the concepts that constitute this battle, actually, we're letting it be. So we are becoming much more present. So in that sense, meditation doesn't introduce something new, but it enables us to part from a normal, distracted condition where we're actually not really relating to our world and bringing us into properly, fully relating to the world. Okay, that's a little bit about what we're doing here. And I'm always sort of attempting to sort of get it all in there. But of course, Buddhist meditation there's a lot to be said about it. One thing that we do here, and what we do in many Buddhist traditions, is that we preface meditation with something that invokes a dimension that lies beyond the ordinary, you could say, unimaginative, narrow scope of our confusion. So ordinarily we operate within the whole world of I like this and I don't like that and so on. And in the Buddhist traditions, we would sometimes recite some scriptures or something like that. What we do a lot in the Tibetan tradition is a brief practice of visualization or something that invokes the sacred. In this case, it's just we're just going to chant a liturgy for about 5-10 minutes before we do meditation, which really just invokes the presence of the Buddha. So there's a liturgy that goes with that. Michela will kindly hand out. And we do that really just as a preface before we meditate. So when we're meditating, we practice like I was just describing before. But before we do that, we do invoke the image of the Buddha, the presence of the Buddha, the memory of the Buddha. And this is actually what we refer to as Buddha Anusmriti in the Buddhist traditions. It really just means recollecting the Buddha. But it has this quality of what we call blessing. It takes us out of the ordinary rational mind and the ordinary patterning of the ordinary mind and takes us into something greater. So this is where we talk about blessing, something that's more than just the ordinary rational mind, but which brings about something really powerful and meaningful. So we'll chant that, and then at one point we dissolve the reference to the Buddha as external. And we could say at that point we engage the internal aspect of Buddha, the natural abiding inner purity, through then the practice of meditation. And then at the end there's a aspiration prayer that we chant. So what we're going to do is take now a 2-minute break. Then we'll chant the Buddha liturgy. Then we'll do 15 minutes of sitting, 5 minutes of mindful walking, and then again 15 minutes of sitting. And remind me next time to explain something about the walking meditation. I always forget that, but okay.
You don't have to walk 1 second minute.
However you like. Okay, 2-minute break, then we'll begin. Okay, so on page 3. So there's this quote where it says, in the Samadhi Raj Sutra, it said, those who while walking, sitting, standing, or sleeping recollect the moonlight Buddha will always be in the Buddha's presence and will attain the vast nirvana. And his pure body is the color of gold. Beautiful is the protector of the world. Whoever visualizes him like this practices the meditation of the Bodhisattvas. In keeping with this, we should practice remembering our incomparable teacher, the Lord of Sages, in the following way. In the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly, I take refuge until I attain enlightenment. Through the merit of practicing generosity and so on, may I attain Buddhahood for the benefit of beings. In the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly, I take refuge until I attain enlightenment. Through the merit of practicing generosity and so on, may I attain Buddhahood for the benefit of all beings. In the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly, I take refuge until I attain enlightenment. Through the merit of practicing generosity and so on, may I attain Buddhahood for the benefit of all beings. May all sentient beings enjoy happiness and the causes of happiness. May they be free from suffering and the causes of suffering. May they never be separated from the sacred happiness devoid of suffering. And may they dwell in boundless equanimity that is free from attachment and aversion. As the union of unborn emptiness and the ceaseless appearance of interdependence. Magically there appears before me in the sky, amidst vast clouds of offerings, on a jewel-lined throne, in lotus, sun, and moon disk seats, the incomparable teacher, Lion of the Shakyas. His body the color of gold, adorned with major and minor marks. Clad in the 3 Dharma robes, he sits in Vajra posture, his right hand gracefully poised in the earth-touching mudra, and his left hand in the gesture of meditation, holding an alms bowl full of nectar. Like a mountain of gold, magnificent he shines in splendor, spreading beams of wisdom light across the whole expanse of space. The 8 close suns, 16 elders and the like, a vast ocean-like retinue of noble beings encircle him all around. Simply think of him and he grants the glory of the highest bliss, liberation from samsara and nirvana, the 2 extremes. He is the great being, perfect embodiment of every source of refuge. With your great compassion, you embraced this turbulent and degenerate world and made 500 mighty aspirations. You are as exalted as the white lotus. Whoever hears your name shall never return to samsara. Most compassionate teacher, to you I pay homage. All my own and others' virtues of body, speech, and mind, together with all our possessions, visualized like Samantabhadra's offering clouds, I offer to you. All the harmful actions and transgressions I have committed throughout beginningless time, each and every one I now confess with intense and heartfelt regret. In all virtuous actions of the noble ones and ordinary beings, accumulated throughout the past, present, and future, I rejoice. Turn the wheel of the profound and vast Dharma teachings, ceaselessly and in every direction, I pray. Your wisdom body is like space and remains changeless throughout past, present, and future. Yet in the perception of those to be guided, you go through the display of birth and death. Even so, let your form body continue always to appear. Through all the virtues I have accumulated in the past, I am accumulating now and will accumulate in the future, for the sake of benefiting all beings who are as infinite as space. May you, the sovereign of Dharma, be forever pleased, and may all attain the state of the victorious one, the Lord of Dharma. Living beings like us, adrift in this degenerate age, have no guidance nor protection. Because of your kindness, caring for us with surpassing compassion, every manifestation in this world now of the 3 jewels is your enlightened activity. You are then our only refuge, incomparable, supreme. So from our hearts we pray with total confidence and faith. Do not neglect, but hold us until we attain enlightenment with your compassion. Supreme Teacher, Bhagavan Tathagata, Arhat, complete and perfect Buddha, glorious conqueror, Shakyamuni Buddha, to you I pay homage, to you I make offerings, in you I take refuge. Supreme Teacher Bhagavan Tathagata Arhat, complete and perfect Buddha, glorious conqueror, Shakyamuni Buddha, to you I pay homage, to you I make offerings, in you I take refuge. Supreme Teacher Bhagavan Tathagata Arhat, complete and perfect Buddha, glorious conqueror, Shakyamuni Buddha, to you I pay homage, to you I make offerings, in you I take refuge. Te yatao muni muni mahamunaya soha. 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 Te yadao muni muni mahamunaya soha. Te yadao muni muni mahamunaya soha. Te yadao muni muni mahamunaya soha. O 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 muni muni mahamunaya so 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 muni muni mahamunaya. O muni muni mahamunaya so muni muni mahamunaya so muni muni mahamunaya. O muni muni mahamunaya so muni muni mahamunaya soha. From the Buddha's body, there emanates a great radiance, a multicolored rays of wisdom light, dispelling all our own and others' obscurations, and causing all the genuine qualities of the Mahayana path to arise within us, so that we attain the level from which we will never return again to samsara. The miraculous display of the unsurpassable wisdom appears as the intentions, deeds, prayers, knowledge, love, and ability of all the Sugatas and their children. May all beings become exactly like them. And the aspiration prayer, Maitreya. I prostrate to all the Buddhas and to the Bodhisattvas, endowed with the divine eye of the sages, and to the Shravakas as well. I prostrate to Bodhicitta, which counteracts births in all lower realms, perfectly shows the path to the higher realms, and leads to no aging nor death. Whatever negative actions I have done are under the influence of an afflicted mind. In the presence of the Buddhas, I fully acknowledge them all. By the accumulation of any merit I have created through the three kinds of activities, may my seed of omniscience grow, and may I attain awakening that never ends. Whatever offerings to the Buddhas that can be found in realms of the 10 directions are known to the Buddhas who rejoice in them. I rejoice in all these offerings. I fully acknowledge all negative actions and rejoice in all merit. I prostrate to all the Buddhas. May I attain supreme primordial wisdom. I earnestly request the Bodhisattvas who reside on the 10 levels, in all the direction of the worlds in the 10 directions, to awaken into supreme enlightenment. Once you have awakened into genuine enlightenment and tamed the Maras and their hordes, may you turn the wheel of Dharma so that all living beings may be healed. With the sound of the great Dharma drum, may you free all sentient beings who are suffering. Throughout inconceivable millions of kalpas, may you remain and teach the Dharma. Mired in the swamp of desire, entangled in the strands of cyclic existence, I am fettered by all that binds. I supplicate those, supreme among humans, to look upon me. The Buddhas do not blame sentient beings who are flawed. With a loving heart for all sentient beings, may the Buddhas free them from the ocean of cyclic existence. Any perfect Buddhas who are present, those who have passed away and those yet to come, may I train following in their way and engage in enlightened conduct. Having perfected the 6 paramitas, may I liberate the 6 families of sentient beings. Having actualized the 6 extraordinary faculties, may I reach unexcelled enlightenment. Future phenomena are not born, and those past will not occur. Present phenomena have no inherent nature. There is no actual location. There is no perception. There are no outer things. May I realize the Dharmadhatu of emptiness. According to the Buddhas, the great sages, there are no truly existent sentient beings, no life force. There is no truly existent individual and no nurturing of a self. May I realize the Dharmata where the self is not present. An entity such as grasping onto a self and mind is not present within any of the paramitas. To benefit all sentient beings, may I give with generosity free of avarice. Since things do not exist as entities, may my wealth appear spontaneously. Since all things totally disintegrate, may I perfect the paramita of generosity. Endowed with the flawless ethics that is guided by rules, and an ethics that is completely pure, with an ethics free of an arrogant mind, may I perfect the paramita of ethics. Just as the elements of earth, water, fire, and wind, bodhisattvas do not remain caught by mental constructs. By attaining patience, anger never arises. May I perfect the paramita of patience. Through the power of previous perseverance, having become stable, enthusiastic, and free of laziness, and through a strong body and mind, may I perfect the paramita of perseverance. Through the samadhi where all is illusion-like, through the samadhi of the hero's stride, and through the samadhi that is like Avadra, may I perfect the paramita of meditative concentration. Through actualizing the 3 gates of full liberation, the equal nature of the 3 times, and the 3 types of knowing as well, may I perfect the paramita of prajna. Through persevering in a bodhisattva's practice, may I attain the kaya praised by all the Buddhas, the luminous kaya and the kaya blazing with majesty. Thus may my intention be fulfilled. May I be like the famed Maitreya, who engaged in such a practice. perfected the paramitas, and perfectly abides at the zenith of the 10th level. By this merit may all attain omniscience, may defeat the enemy wrongdoing. From the stormy waves of birth, old age, sickness and death, from the ocean of samsara, may all beings be freed. May bodhicitta, precious and sublime, arise where it has not yet come to be, and where it has arisen may it never fail, but grow and flourish ever more and more. May the Buddha appear in this world, may the light of the teaching shine like the sun, may the holders of the teaching live in harmony, and thus may all be auspicious for the teaching to endure. We pray for the good health of the teachers. We pray for their precious lives to be long. We pray for their activities to spread and increase. May we be blessed never to part from the teachers. Akashasya stiti yavat yavatcha jagatah stiti tavan mama stiti bhuyaha Jagadugani nignata Akashasya stiti yavatcha jagatah stiti tavan mama stiti bhuya Jagadugani nignata Tavan mama stiti bhuya jagadukani nignata. Tavan mama stiti bhuya jagadukani nignata. As long as space remains, as long as the world remains, may I too remain to alleviate the sufferings of the world. Thank you very much.